Welcome everybody to another very special episode of Legends and Lectures. I'm here with the one, the only, the philologist, Stephen Hopkins. Stephen, will you please explain to everybody what a philologist is and why you
Oh,
you capitalize the lol?
well, a philologist, traditionally speaking, right, is a scholar who works at the intersection of literature and linguistics, we might say. It's kind of an old-fashioned, old-timey 19th century term. Um, and it describes a certain kind of literature scholar who brings, close reading, linguistic study to usually ancient texts, right? Ancient or medieval texts, if you care to delineate between those. Philology has been jokingly called the art of reading very slowly. Um, and if you've been in my classes translating, you'll know one word at a time can take us an hour to get through a page, right? Which is why it's good, right? But my handle, right, is philologist, because try my best to combine arcane lore and learning with absolutely asinine memery. So
And
that's there.
and as we know, thou shalt not be remembered by the merit of your work, but by thy memes.
Yes, yeah, it's all about the likes and the retweets, rather than getting tenure or like being gainfully employed or something. Yeah.
Tenure, what's that? That doesn't exist anymore. Oh, the only thing that matters are memes nowadays. So
Right.
you have as part of your long list of things, medievalist, philologist, and linguist. But in your new book, you've kind of melded these three things together. And so we're here mostly to talk about your new book, which I love this title so much, Translating Hell. Vernacular Theory and Apocrypha in the Medieval North Sea. So I just want to read a tiny bit from the first page because I want to give people a taste of how this is written because I think it has very much of your sense of humor, even though it is an academic text and it's very academic. But I think you make it as one person says, highly readable. So here it says, Imagine a man you trust pulls you aside and reveals to you that once, not too long ago, he had been just going about his daily business when he was suddenly snatched up by an invisible force into the heavens, where he experienced an extended vision of the mysteries of the world beyond our own, and that he had returned from it unharmed. But he had been forbidden by God from ever revealing what he saw. You might well raise an eyebrow and put some distance between yourself and this man. Not only is this an incredible claim, but if he cannot reveal what he saw, then why bring it up in the first place? And I think that's absolutely fantastic. So, Stephen, what is this getting us geared toward?
Yeah, so thanks for your generous and I think fun reading of that, right? I don't know if Manchester's ever going to do an audiobook, but that's the way to do it. Yeah, so I picked this opening anecdote. It's really, honestly, it's really the genesis of the whole project, as far as like my own reading of some of the Pauline letters goes, right? Like, as someone who spent a lot of time reading all the Pauline letters, because I'm a scholar of Apocrypha, and you can't really be a scholar of apocryphal scriptures if you don't also know the canonical scriptures pretty well, right? But that's like there's a part in Second Corinthians that has just always struck me as absolutely bizarre, right? Where Paul does this. He says, he brags about himself in the third person, right? Which is also a weird rhetorical move. And he basically says, I know a guy who was yanked up into the third heaven and saw all sorts of unspeakable things, that I have been or that he has been forbidden from saying, right? And if that person were going to boast, this is one reason why that person might have apostolic authority. It's such a strange verse, and growing up and reading the canonical letters, I could never find anyone in my life who could explain what that was about, right? I could find no Bible commentaries that said anything interesting or useful about that. So that was always kind of in the back of my brain. But then when I went to write a dissertation and I had already been thinking about hell and sort of like visions of the afterlife and stuff, I came back to that verse and I thought, what the hell is Paul doing, right? Um, why is he doing this? And then I found out that there was a whole I was not the first person to ask this question. There's actually a grand tradition stretching back all the way to the second century of other people asking, "What?" Like, well, you saw this vision and great mysteries were revealed to you, and you're not going to tell us about it. That seems
Nope.
kind of important. Um, And so the vision of St. Paul is the apocryphal text that grows up in response to this verse, where Paul is taken on sort of a, sort of, some people call it like a proto-Dantean journey of the afterlife. He's taken up to heaven. He sees all sorts of things that are not very exciting. He's taken down to hell. He sees a lot of things that are much more exciting. And yeah, and so it's sort of our first, well, technically our second big vision of the afterlife apocrypha text. So that's where I decided to start the book, was just with sort of the puzzling, kind of head-scratching relationship between this canonical text that is supposed to be authoritative and divinely inspired, right? Basically saying, I know a lot more than I'm allowed to tell, which is a weird thing for an an inspired voice to say, but then it also gets at the sort of reaction that people had as audiences to that same moment, right? And a lot of people couldn't help but basically make up an answer to that question. I think it gets at sort of the dynamic that I try to trace in the book of people reading these authoritative texts and wanting more, and then having to invent more because there isn't more in the canon.
Since you likened writing a dissertation to being in hell, tell us
More
your book.
purgatorial, really.
We are going to talk about purgatory, absolutely, but let's talk about the language of hell. Where did this word hell come from? Because the obviously no, the Bible is in ancient Hebrew and doesn't
Right.
use this word hell. It
Right.
uses words like Sheol, Gehenna, etc. So where does this word hell come from?
Yeah, that's a great starting point, right? You should always start with etymology, I tell my students. Um, Hell itself, right, is a Germanic word of slightly misty provenance. If you go into Holthausen's Old English's Etymologisches Wörterbuch, right, which is literally the only etymological resource for Old English, and it's like 100 years old. Um, he basically just compares it to some Old Norse and putative Old Germanic forms that basically say hell seems to be related to words associated with holes, caves, right? It's a subterranean place. Presumably, it's where they thought the dead went. Of course, this doesn't really tell us anything about it, right? And it also raises the specter of influence, which is always a landmine for anyone doing pre-Christian Germanic stuff, right? Did they have a conception of an underground afterlife on their own? Did they come up with that by themselves, or is this their reception of Greco-Roman ideas or Christian ideas, filtering Greco-Roman ideas, right? So it becomes a very complicated genealogy. The person who's traced this most robustly is Alan Bernstein in his book, The Formation of Hell, which I, cite dutifully. It's a great book. And I think that came out in 1993. But he basically traces, the very many different versions of the idea of hell that come not only from the Hebrew Bible, but also from Greco-Roman tradition, and sort of how did these become conflated and combined with a third strand about hell in the early Christian era, right? So there's the Greco-Roman tradition, which is basically Hades, right? This is where we get the idea of Hades, which some New Testament texts do use the actual word Hades. For the Greeks and the Romans, this seems to have mostly, well, it evolved, right? In our earliest texts, it seems to be a neutral grave. Everybody dies, everything's really gray and dull, and nothing happens. And like the ghosts, for instance, the shades in when Odysseus goes down to Hades, right? They're just all sort of sad images of their former selves, right? They're almost like recordings of souls that don't really seem to have like a whole brain or personality, right? But they do like blood, and so when he makes an offering, they all come rushing to the blood. Virgil recycles the same scene but gives it an interesting twist. So that's sort of the Greco-Roman understanding, is just like everyone dies and everyone goes to Hades. It's just the container that all the spent souls get sent to, right? If you're into Platonism, right, there's an interesting extra foil to it where souls are purged and purgated and then they get recycled and reincarnated, right? But they don't remember anything thanks to the river Lethe. So that's the Greco-Roman tradition. One of the things that Bernstein argues is that over the longue durée, you know, even within the Greco-Roman tradition, but especially when we get to the Hebrew Bible and the Minor Prophets, the question of justice becomes increasingly weighty, right? It doesn't seem fair that everyone should have the same fate if people live, some people live good lives and some people live terrible lives and make other people's lives hell on earth, right? Before that concept exists, I guess a little anachronistic joke. But yeah, so yeah, they're sort of wrestling with the idea of if especially in a monotheistic religion, right? They're wrestling with the idea of if there is a God who is good and is powerful, then like how could he, it's theodicy, how could he allow suffering to go unpunished, right? That Hades needs to be something more than that, and this is where the minor prophets start talking about Gehenna, which may or may not have been an ancient sacrificial site, child sacrificial site, may or may not have been a garbage dump. There's a lot of fragments that coalesce into that myth,
It's
right?
a big
Uh,
fire pit.
it's a
Hooray.
it's a fire pit, right? And it's a place where maybe you don't want to be indiscriminately chucked and forgotten, right? Um, and maybe you're gonna, but the idea that you're going to be conscious in it, and the idea that it's a place of torment, is one that emerges gradually, slowly, and in fragments, right? One of the early, sorry about I don't know if you can hear the
They
ambulance
heard
out
you. They heard you talking about hell on earth,
there.
which is 14th century, that idea. And now they're coming to wee woo you off to hell. So you're
So
going.
this is one of the perks of having my office building fairly close to the university hospital. Um, but yeah, anyway, what was I saying? I lost my train of thought.
You're talking about we're talking about whoa. So you they attribute this word hell to Gehenna, which is an actual
Right.
place
Oh
or
yeah,
may
yeah.
have been an actual place. And then there's also Sheol, which is a different concept.
Yeah, right, right, right. And so, yeah, so Sheol seems to maybe reflect the more neutral grave connotation, right? Or maybe it's even just a euphemism in some texts, like in the Psalms, where the psalmist says, "Don't let me go down to Sheol," right? Like that seems to mean in context, just like God, don't forget about me, right? Um, so the question is, how do we get from that to the sort of punitive, retributive hell that we see in I almost said in the New Testament, but one of the points of my book is we don't really even see it there, right?
Nope.
There's only like a half a dozen verses that very obliquely reference the concept of hell. Um, Jesus says that it's a place of wailing and gnashing of teeth, which doesn't sound great, to be fair. Um, and there's a parable with Lazarus and the rich man, and it sounds like the rich man is not having a good time down there. He's begging for just one drop of water, right? For just a quick little drink would be great. So like it doesn't sound great, but it's not clear like who goes there or why or for how long or like is it punitive or is it purgative or like there's almost no detail about it, right? Peter references it a couple of times in his letters, or in the Petrine letters, I should say, to be more precise. But again, Jesus goes down to preach to the souls in prison. What is that? Is that hell?
Yeah, I
A
mean, when
lot
I
of
was doing Bible study in for 15 years, I mean, mostly Old Testament, it's not there. But
yeah, yeah, yeah.
I can tell you the words in ancient Hebrew, but the concept of what we think of hell is not there. So it really started with mostly Enochian text. And so let's
Right.
talk about who invented hell, Stephen. Who invented it?
I think the official answer is God. Um, And there's a really great old Irish apocryphon about that, about how hell was made even before the fall, because God foreknew. But it was like I forget what it's this weird text that I actually don't talk about in the book. I regretted having to cut it, but you can't have everything
Oh
in an already too
no.
long book. But it's called the Ever New Tongue, in Tenga Bivnua, and it's like this weird cosmological vision. But it says that before the fall, hell was just a seed of a beautiful white flower. And God made it because he knew that sin was coming and that it blossomed into hell after the fall, which is
That
kind of a
sounds like a
wild.
really nice hell, though. There's no
I mean,
fire.
it grows and it expands, and I guess it gets thorns. But yeah, so anyway, back to your actual question, who invented it, right? I think you're gesturing towards one of the key moments in the history of the idea, and that is the non-canonical Enochic books that start cropping up in, ooh, I don't know what's non-controversial. We'll just say in the couple of centuries in the intertestamental period, right? Um, in the couple of centuries BC after the Babylonian exile, right? Um, where we get these visions that are attributed to Enoch, who, in the book of Genesis, lived quite a while, and lucky for him, did not have to die, right? Taken
Was
straight
it
up.
really lucky though? He didn't have a great time.
Yeah, in the apocryphal tradition, he has an even worse time. There's another Irish text called "The Two Sorrows of the Kingdom of Heaven," where Enoch and Elijah are the two sorrows, because they're the only two people in heaven who haven't died yet. And they're being kept alive forever and ever until Antichrist comes, and then they have to duel him with their swords at the Last Judgment, and they have to lose, and that's one reason why they're sad.
That's pretty boss text though. That's
Yeah, it's
pretty
really
great.
cool. It's really cool. Yeah, basically all the best apocrypha happens in Old Irish.
I was gonna say the Book of Giants is pretty dope, but no, that one sounds even better.
In the book, well, and thank you for bringing me back to that. In the Book of Giants, right, in the Enochic books, right, hell seems to have been created. It's not super clear, right, but it seems to have been created in response to, and this is maybe the seed of the legend as it shows up in Old English or in the Middle Ages in general, right? It was a space that was created to sort of imprison the rebellious sons of God who mate with the daughters of men in Genesis 6, right? These are depending on how you interpret it, this is the moment where the Nephilim come in, right? Where we've got maybe they're fallen angels in some traditions, maybe they're, some medievalists, or not medievalists, sorry, some medieval people tried to sort of massage this and say that, like, well, that's actually probably just the offspring of Cain mixing with the
Mhm.
offspring of Seth, and that was a no-no, right? But that's not how a lot of people have interpreted it over the years, right? A lot of people have said, this is Satan and the fallen angels, and they are seducing pretty ladies, and they are making giant problematic children, and that is why God has to flood the earth to get rid of them, right? And so that's sort of like the Enochic tradition is that God has made this prison house, right, to store these beings, and then bad people also wind up there after the judgment, right? And the idea that there is going to be a last judgment is something that makes it's one of its earliest appearances in the Enochic books. We don't. It's hard to put that in a chronology with the minor prophets, who also, are looking forward to a day of judgment. And sometimes when I'm scrolling through the news on social media, so am I, right? So I get it.
I don't think that shall ever come. But then we have this idea then much later about purgatory. So who invented purgatory and what problems does purgatory solve? Or having purgatory solve, I should say.
Um, yeah. So purgatory is, I mean, we could say that, like, in the grand scheme of things, like the idea of purgatory, sort of in the Dantean sense, is something that grows slowly over the Middle Ages and finally becomes robustly developed by, say, the, I don't know, 11 to 1200s is what, like, Jacques Le Goff said in his classic The Birth of Purgatory. I think he oversimplifies, by especially by focusing on Latin texts to the exclusion of other things, which is one reason why I wrote my book, right? Was what if we looked at things that are not in Latin? What happens with hell there? But that's only part of the story. And one thing that I try to convey in this book, right, especially in the first chapter, which focuses on late antiquity and the growth, almost the wrestling over the concept of what hell is and how to define it, is that from the get-go, there seems to have been at least a sizable population of people who wanted hell to be purgative from the get-go, right? The idea, and there are again scattered verses in the New Testament. That's the thing. This is all very vaguely defined. There are scattered verses in the New Testament that say things like, Christ is reconciling all things to himself, right? All things. If it's all things, then, like, does that, like, how far do we spread that, right? If he's, I mean, this could be like a really positive image, right? Not only is he gonna, like, come back with a second judgment and make evil go away, but also, like, fix the whole cosmos, fix, like, nature, fix, like, death will be gone, right? Like, this could be really exciting. Fix the planet, fix the cosmos, whatever. I don't know what that means for the second law of thermodynamics and where entropy goes, but I'm not sure that they were worried about that. Um,
The fire in hell is cold. It's fine.
and parts of it. That's a later development, right? Actually, you get fleeting images of it early on, but yeah. The point was misery, right? with the hot and the cold thing, and then eventually it sort of gets more symbolic weight. Um,
So really, hell is just menopause. That's what it is.
yeah, alternating hot and cold, as they would say in Arrested Development. Um, yeah, so there's this strain of like Origen is one of the church fathers who really um, is sympathetic to the idea that there is such a thing, that there's a purpose to hell, right? That it's temporary and that it will sort of burn away the badness in our souls, and then after we've been purified, right? This refiner's fire, then everybody will be in heaven. Everything will be great. Everything will be perfect, right? Ultimately, like good triumphs perfectly and completely, right? Other church fathers were not comfortable with this, right? Um, People like Jerome and Augustine worked quite hard to make sure that that reading did not become mainstream. But one of the things I think is interesting is you see instances of it in some of these earliest versions of the apocryphal texts that I trace in the book, right? So the Gospel of Nicodemus and the Vision of St. Paul. The vision of St. Paul grows out of the vision of, or the Apocalypse of Peter. They're actually surprisingly similar when you read them. It's almost hard to tell them apart like on your first pass.
They're just
Um,
copying homework at that point.
I mean, yeah, I don't want to bring ChatGPT up, but it's the question of did I copy it or did I just use it to improve my writing, right? The idea, yeah, intellectual copyright didn't exist back then, right? You were allowed to everybody pirated in a sense. Um, but yeah, it's in the earliest versions of those texts, there are hints that everybody is going to be saved eventually. And Origen even provocatively asks, could even Judas be saved, right? The arch traitor. And the Irish have a field day with this, which is most of the fun that happens in my second chapter. But
So
yeah,
you
so
actually mentioned very specifically in your title, and obviously in the latter half of the book, you talk very much about the North Sea. And so if you could tell us a little bit about how Ireland and England were very influential in creating the ideas of hell and purgatory.
yeah, yeah, yeah. So the book is actually, I tried to set it up chronologically as much as possible, given the behemoth that it is. But it's something that is, I think, widely accepted but hard to prove in the field is that the Irish had an unusually large store of apocrypha compared to other early medieval Christian communities in and around the North Sea. Um, I think it's non-controversial to say that they have texts that they really don't seem to have any business having. The only other known analogs are like in Syriac or Coptic. And we're like, how did this get over to the other side? I mean, the other side of the Roman Empire, right? I guess, out the Mediterranean, out the gates of Hercules, and then hook a hard right, right? Um, what are they doing there, especially this early, right? We have evidence that these things are well known by the 700s. Um, and so, one theory that I'm sympathetic towards is that maybe some of this apocryphal innovation grows out of the fact that Ireland has all of these texts, and England, of course, famously converts in 597 or after 597, after the other Augustine is sent by Pope Gregory the Great to convert them, right? That there's this vibrant, intellectually rich church already right next door. And there's a lot of cross-pollination in, say, early Northumbria, right, which is sort of the powerhouse of early medieval learning. Bede's houses of Monk, Wearmouth, and Jarrow become sort of the twin capitals of learning in the greater North Sea region. But they owe a lot to houses like Lindisfarne and Iona and scholars from Ireland. So it's not hard to imagine that they're cross-pollinating with all of these rare, obscure texts that the Irish seem to be particularly excited about. There is not consensus in England about whether we should be excited about all of these apocrypha or not, right? Bede seems cautiously okay with them. He'll cite them when he needs to like prove a point of doctrine. But then you get, we'll say, crankier churchmen like Aldhelm or sorry, Alfrich, who are explicitly against Apocrypha. Alfrich disses the Vision of St. Paul at length in a letter, so by name. So they will, there's a lot of, I will say, strain that you can sort of see going on in the background as to whether these texts are useful or not, whether they're dangerous or not. And yet, there's also a constant copying and recopying of them. Hundreds of copies of these texts exist, which is unusual in what survives from the Middle Ages, right? So I think, given all of that, of course, England and Ireland play a role in shaping or reimagining, I would say, contextualizing and localizing what hell is because they have more options, right? More textual options to choose from in imagining. It's not just the handful of verses in the Bible that are quite ambiguous, but they also have all of this rich tradition of Apocrypha to sort of pick and choose from and say, oh, well, if I have particular cultural enemies that I want to ascribe to there, I will take this hell, right? Or I will take this particular motif from this one text because we know about it, right? So the customization, I think, the bespoke hell, if you will, it's not like a large concerted effort, but it's like sort of a constant experimentation that is going on with these fringe texts. And it becomes powerful because of the dubious sort of ambiguous nature of apocrypha themselves, right? They look and sound like scripture, they're not scripture. So some people feel free to revise them, some people feel free to revere them. It depends on how, what your attitude towards apocrypha is and how dangerous or authoritative you think they should be.
So how does our buddy Bede talk about hell?
Bede is he's pretty orthodox, surprise, surprise. Um, except for when he's not. Uh,
That's
for the,
him. It's
yeah, yeah,
like,
yeah.
but Bede tells the truth except for when he doesn't. So you go, thanks, buddy. Are you going to tell us when you're telling? No? Okay, great. We'll have to figure it out. Fine.
I actually had a lot of fun with this question in the book. The third chapter, the Old English chapter, starts off with Bede because, I think a lot of people think of Bede as very straight-laced and very, you know, he's very interested in telling the history of the Church of England and his ecclesiastical history. And he's thought of in a lot of ways as a very
Venerable character.
venerable, right, as the nickname suggests. He's trustworthy. He's a good historian, is what some people say, right? Like projecting our own values back then, right? He's a surprisingly good and trustworthy historian for the early Middle Ages. And to be fair, that does seem to be kind of true, right? He actually bothered to interview people to fact check when he could, right? And that's great. But sometimes when he needs a rhetorical flourish, he's not afraid to spice hell up, right? Which is why I open with a series of anecdotes that happen pretty late in the ecclesiastical history, where he talks about various people who have near-death experiences, we might call them, right? Where they maybe possibly die for a minute and see a vision of hell, and then they come back, right? Or else they're very, very ill and they have maybe a fever dream or something, a vision of hell right at the 11th hour. Um, and he seems to be okay with telling these stories if they're edifying in his judgment. Um, and so yeah, so in these cases, right, we get a glimpse of a very emotionally charged, scary hell. I don't know if you've seen the 2009 movie Drag Me to Hell. Um, I think it was directed by Sam Raimi, right?
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. This is the beads drag me to hell moment, right? Where he's specifically invoking visions of hell to scare people, right, into making a good spiritual decision, right, into correcting their behavior, into being more generous, giving alms to the poor before it's too late, kind of thing, right? It is, as most of the billboards that I grew up seeing along the highway in Ohio, it's the turn or burn bead, right? Um, and so, that's like I think one of the more obvious uses of like, well, why would people talk about hell in the first place? It's rhetorically useful for that move, right? For calling people to change their ways or reform or whatever, right? Even Dickens does it in A Christmas Carol.
Of course.
Uh, yeah, yeah, yeah. So Bede is, we will say, rich and complex. Um, I find it kind of, I would say, I find it endearing that he doesn't turn away from the entire genre, even though, some people did, right? Like, Augustine is not super keen on Apocrypha in general. Jerome, if you read the Argumenta, the little prefaces that he writes for every single book of the Bible when he translates the Vulgate for the first time, he will flag things if he thinks that they should not be, or that they're apocryphal in some way, right? Like his epistle to the Laodiceans, he explicitly says this is not a real letter by Paul, right? But I'm going to translate it because people like it. So, yeah, the warning label, I think, is its Bede isn't quite there with it. He thinks that they're useful sometimes.
So we have hell and we have
Yeah.
purgatory, but these all ultimately lead to the concept of salvation. And so especially the latter part of your book talks about angling for salvation. So will you tell us who invented this idea of angling for salvation and why it's so important with hell and why they go together?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's probably the most insufferable pun in the book, I think. Right, it's called angling for salvation, both to convey the idea that people are using these texts and reworking them creatively to sort of angle for their ancestors. In this case, the Icelanders are trying to grandfather in their grandfathers, who could not have been Christians before the conversion, but they don't want to consign them to hell necessarily, right? So it's angling in that sense, but it's also, just a bad fishing pun. Because it's also about Thor's fishing trip and angling in that sense. But yeah, the idea that hell could be like when you experiment with hell, there are theological consequences, right? If you change the rules of who does or does not belong, that has implications for how you see other people in the present or the past, right? So some chapters explore that dynamic in different ways, right? The Welsh chapter is more focused on like the present and political tensions with the Anglo-Normans and things like that, whereas the Old Norse chapter is very much focused on how do we change the rules of hell so that we can basically keep and honor our heritage that we love so much, right? One of the big questions that any early medievalist has, right, or even students like in my 1000 level Vikings myths and sagas class, one of the questions they always ask is, wait, why were the Icelanders allowed to keep all of their myths, right? Where are the English myths, the early medieval English myths? They'll also ask where the old Irish myths are, and we actually do have those.
We do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
Although we can
aside from
argue
those
about
two,
when they were written or not, yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Old slash Middle Irish is an absolute minefield that we don't have to wade into because I don't think either of us, well, maybe I should only speak for myself, are philologically gifted enough to
Old
to wade
Irish,
into
no.
that authoritatively.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so with the Old Norse though, like why does Snorri get to write the whole prose Edda, right? Why do we have the poetic Edda? Why do they have all these pagan stories after they converted, right? Everybody else had to like get rid of those. The
But are
English,
they but are they pagan if they have concepts like Ragnarok and Valkyries, which are
right.
very, yeah.
And that's something that the field there's really no consensus, right? People have very strong opinions on how much of that is authentically pre-Christian. Um, People have strong opinions on, well, is it like Christian motifs that have been sort of recycled or laundered in some way, given a Norse heathen veneer? Did that fusion happen before the conversion period while there was missionary contact? Did it happen much later by curious Icelanders who just want it, who are just into this stuff because it's cool and metal? Um, those are all open questions. Um, but what
I
we
guess
can say is,
Snorri was allowed to write it down, I guess. I mean, because he was a Christian. People forget that he was raised as a Christian.
yeah, 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 and I would always push back on students saying things like he was allowed to. I think it's worth reflecting upon the fact that he lives on a beautiful little rock way out at the edge of the world, right? In Latin maps, even as far back as the Roman Empire, call Iceland or what might be Iceland Ultima Thule, right? Which is like the absolute end of the world, right? So I always make sure that my students realize that like the papacy was not strong back then. Whatever you're imagining is going on with like witch hunts and like witch hunts are an early modern thing, right?
Yeah.
Or inquisitions, right? Also pretty much an early modern Spain thing, right? The church isn't going around quashing voices of dissent or heresy like this. There's no centralized power, right? Especially if you're in Iceland. They have their own little tiny bishopric, and then they have another bishopric, sometimes in Norway, sometimes in Hamburg, Bremen, depending on the century. Um, in other words, he could kind of do what he wanted. He was
Yeah, I mean,
powerful in his own
this
realm.
is why they had synods, right? To determine things like the date of Easter, because people were celebrating these things at different times. Because, as you say, the papal hand could only go so far, and then they had to rein it back in eventually, much later, going, okay, 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 let's unify this stuff.
Yeah, exactly, right. So there, yeah, it wasn't. We shouldn't imagine there was a central authority back then, which I think is probably why Apocrypha are able to be as powerful and useful as they are in this time period, because you know it's kind of the Wild West of theology.
I mean, even in the early Middle Ages, people didn't agree, aren't they? Look at Odilo of Cluny, who was just like, "Yes, purgatory is a thing, and everybody can pray. And now we're going to have a Day of the Dead, where
Exactly.
you everybody is going to celebrate the fact that we're all ghosts,
Yeah.
and that you could,
Gregory the Great seems to be totally fine with the idea of purgatory, and that's
yeah.
as of the 600s, right? The early 600s. So, yeah, a variety of opinions exist, and there's really not. Um, They don't live in a police state, right? They can't enforce things.
Oh, the same thing with salvation. Some people believe in it, and some people don't. And so, even in medieval times, even in your text, you have that sort of that salvation has to be the natural answer to a purgatory, because otherwise, what is the point of a purgatory?
Right. Yeah, there has to be a teleology to it, right? And again, I think that's caught up with the questions of theodicy and like, what is the point of existence generally, right? If it is to make everything better, then to recuperate, right, or rehabilitate everything, then that implies an ultimate state of goodness from which everything has fallen and to which everything will return, right? Um, and yeah, I think that's baked into their worldview very deeply.
And so, I mean, your te the book is very long, which I had a lovely time reading. So,
You're welcome.
if if you had one thing that you wanted people to take away from translating hell and these ideas of the invention of hell and purgatory and salvation, etc., what would you hope that a student would take away from this book?
Um, that's a great question. Let me think about it for a minute. I think, I mean, I sort of make a gesture towards this idea at the end of the introduction and also in the conclusion, right? But I think for me, one of the big payoffs of this study was just realizing how much power we have as storytellers, right? When we decide, even just deciding which stories we are going to tell, whether it's religious or this even works in broader fiction frameworks in general, right? But the stories that we choose to tell, how we portray others, how we imagine others, equips us and trains us to actually view people like that in real life, right? And so, talking about hell can, like I say I don't know what I said at the end of the introduction, right? But we can bring heaven or we can bring either kingdom down to earth, right? Whether it's heaven or hell based on the power of the stories we tell. And I think the book is sort of an extended meditation on just how much power there is in telling these kinds of stories.